What's up everyone and welcome back to the World History Channel. Before we begin, please hit the subscribe button today. Let's get started. 14 strange facts about the man who invented Sherlock Holmes. Sir Arthur Conan Doyle. You probably know Sir Arthur Conan Doyle as the famous author who created the beloved character Sherlock Holmes. But really, who was Arthur Conan Doyle? Yes, he created one of the most widely recognizable characters in the world, and may have even been responsible for the first ever fandom. But his talents and interests didn't just lie in writing. At different points in his life he was a doctor, an aspiring politician, and a big fan of Tinker Bell. Even though he created one of the most rational fictional characters of all time, later in life the author became interested in the occult, regularly holding seances with family and friends. There are so many interesting facts about Arthur Conan Doyle that it's easy to see how he's every bit as legendary as the famous consulting detective. You'll be confident after reading this Arthur Conan Doyle trivia that the author was just as badass as the character he created. Now venture forth. The game is afoot. He spoke with spirits. Doyle was a big believer of spiritualism, the belief that the living can communicate with the dead, so much so that he wrote several books and articles on the topic and even went on a tour to promote his beliefs. He also claimed to have spoken with the spirits of well-known men, such as Joseph Conrad, Cecil Rhodes, and Earl Haig. Spiritualism was so important to him that he even wished to be remembered for his work communing with spirits rather than his literary accomplishments. Basically, he was a late 19th century version of Alan Moore. He popularized skiing. While living in Switzerland, Doyle took up skiing, still a pretty obscure sport in the 19th century. He brought attention to the sport after publishing a feature article about it in Strand magazine, the publication in which the Sherlock Holmes stories appeared. He wrote, "You have to shuffle along the level, to zigzag or move crab fashion, up the hills, to slide down without losing your balance, and above all to turn with facility." With that ringing endorsement, people in England went crazy for the snow sport. He went out like a classy boss. Doyle's death was so dramatic that it could have been written into a story about Sherlock Holmes. He had been struggling with heart problems for a while, and he died from a heart attack at the age of 71. He was in his garden and reportedly collapsed while holding a flower in one hand and clutching his heart with the other. His wife was with him at the time, and his last words were directed to her. "Flower still in hand," he told her. "You are wonderful. If that doesn't make you choke up a little, you should seek medical attention." He was frenemies with Harry Houdini. The two men met in 1920 and became fast friends. Later, the two had a falling out when Doyle and his family hosted a séance to contact Houdini's mother. After his mother's passing, Houdini attempted to contact his mother through mediums, but quickly realized that the people conducting these séances were frauds. Like a good friend, Houdini partook in one more séance with Doyle, even though he had his doubts. The session was led by Doyle's daughter, who was supposedly a gifted medium. She contacted Houdini's mother and produced 15 pages of notes from the illusionist's mother. Unfortunately, the 15 pages were written in English, a language Houdini's mother did not know. Also, his mother made no mention of the fact that the séance took place on her birthday. Houdini shared his doubts with Doyle, but the author held fast to his belief that they had contacted the women. Their friendship never recovered. He and author George Bernard Shaw had a public fight about the Titanic. Shaw, the author of Pygmalion, the play which was adapted into the film My Fair Lady, had a very heated disagreement with Doyle about the Titanic. About a month after the sinking of the ship, Shaw published an article titled Some Unmentioned Morals, in which he criticized the press for an explosion of outrageous romantic lying regarding the heroics of those on the ship. For example, many witnesses said that the captain of the ship was seen going down with the vessel, ever the sign of a good captain. Shaw argued, however, that not enough coverage of the incident examined facts, such as why the captain was speeding through an area he knew to be populated by icebergs. It was sort of their version of 9/11 truthers. In response to the article, Doyle said, "It is a pitiful sight to see a man of undoubted genius using his gifts in order to misrepresent and decry his own people." He believed in fairies. Like thousands of others, Doyle came to believe in the existence of fairies after seeing the Cottingley Fairies pictures. a series of photographs which provided proof that fairies existed. He spent millions of pounds, not fairy dollars, circulating this proof that fairies existed, and even wrote a book on the subject called The Coming of the Fairies. It was later revealed that the pictures were manipulated. The young girls who took the pictures admitted that the fairies in the so-called evidence were actually paper cutouts. So much for his ability to deduce. The sequel to Jurassic Park is due to him. While Doyle is best known for penning the Sherlock Holmes stories, he's also written works in other genres. Mostly it's a lot of historical fiction, but he also, amazingly, wrote a book about dinosaurs titled The Lost World. You might be thinking, hang on, isn't that the title of another wildly popular book about dinosaurs? Michael Crichton, author of Jurassic Park, has said that the title of his novel is an homage to Doyle's book of the same name. Also, like Doyle's book, Crichton's novel focuses on an expedition to an isolated island populated with dinosaurs. He was ahead of his time, that Doyle. He was a trained medical doctor. Despite being a gifted writer and creating one of the most recognizable and beloved characters of all time, Doyle didn't actually study writing. At least not in a traditional sense. Doyle enrolled in medical school at the University of Edinburgh. During his third year at university, he took a post as a surgeon on a whaling ship. After receiving his degree, he opened his own practice in London, but business was slow going, as the author notes in his autobiography. Every morning I walked from the lodgings at Montague Place, reached my consulting room at 10 and sat there until 3 or 4, with never a ring to disturb my serenity. Good thing he took up fiction instead of like opium or something. He ran for Parliament twice. Doyle ran for Parliament representing the Unionist Party on 2 occasions, once in 1900 and again in 1906. Despite getting a respectable number of votes, he lost both times. A mere 569 votes kept him from getting a coveted seat in the United Kingdom's governing body, where he presumably would have had people shouting, "Elementary! Him all day." He solved mysteries for real. In 1906, Doyle played a role in establishing the innocence of a man who had been accused of mutilating animals. The man in question was George Adalji, who was found guilty and sentenced to 7 years in prison. He completed 3 years of his sentence until he was suddenly released with no explanation. It was then that Adalji wrote to Doyle asking the famous author to help him clear his name and obtain compensation for his suffering. Doyle applied his Holmesian methods to the case and determined that the mud found on Adalji's clothes didn't match the mud at the crime scene, and that the razor which was supposedly used to mutilate one of animals didn't have a trace of blood on it. Also, during his time with Adalji, Doyle observed that the man had to hold the newspaper extremely close to his eyes in order to read the printed words. He argued that since the crime was committed at night, no man with such poor vision could have committed it in the dark. Doyle's deductions helped clear the man's name, but he was not given compensation. Nonetheless, Doyle's investigation contributed to the formation of the Court of Appeals and generated a lot of publicity for the case. He was knighted for writing war propaganda. Many people believe that Doyle became Sir Arthur Conan Doyle for creating Sherlock Holmes, but the author was actually knighted for his involvement in the Boer War, even though he wasn't able to enlist because of his age. He was 41 years old at the time. He still contributed to the war effort by writing British propaganda regarding the war. Conscientious objectors were persuaded to support the war by his pamphlet, which highlighted the British's predicament. In 1902, King Edward VII knighted him for it. He inherited his storytelling talent from his mother. Mary Doyle, Doyle's mother, was an avid reader who frequently shared with her children tales of brave knights and chivalry. Mary's husband, Charles Doyle, suffered from depression and alcoholism, which made life difficult for the rest of the family. According to some sources, she would tell these stories to her children to inspire them to be brave. Doyle cited his mother's stories as fueling his passion for writing. "I am sure, looking back, that it was in attempting to emulate these stories of my childhood that I began weaving dreams myself. So, we should really be thanking Mary Doyle for the rise of Benedict Cumberbatch. He inspired the world's smartest cab driver." A taxi driver approached Doyle shortly after arriving in Boston for a lecture, and referred to him by his name. Surprised, Doyle asked the man how he knew who he was. The exchange went as follows. "If you'll excuse my saying so, the lapels of your coat look as if they had been grabbed by New York reporters, your hair looks as if it had been cut in Philadelphia, your hat looks as if you had to stand your ground in Chicago, and your right shoe has evident buffalo mud under the instep, and dash." "And what?" queried Sir Arthur. "Well," replied the cabman, "I saw Conan Doyle in big white letters on your trunk." He hated Sherlock Holmes. Doyle eventually came to despise his favorite creation. He tried to make a name for himself in other areas, such as spiritualism, in an effort to move on from the detective. The author even went so far as to kill off Sherlock Holmes in the story, The Final Problem, much to his fans' dismay. He wrote the following about his feelings for the character. "I think of slaying Holmes in the sixth and winding him up for good and all, and I am in the middle of the last Holmes story, after which the gentleman vanishes, never to return. I am weary of his name." It's said that after the story was published, fans of the character wore black armbands to symbolize their mourning, and one woman was so upset that she reportedly attacked Doyle with an umbrella. Over 20,000 people cancelled their subscription to the Strand, and many sent in angry letters. Doyle finally gave in to his angry fans and brought Holmes back in the story, The Empty Hearse. Victorian-era fandom at its finest, ladies and gentlemen. You may think you know Sir Arthur Conan Doyle, the genius behind Sherlock Holmes, but the real man was even stranger, wilder, and more fascinating than the world's most famous fictional detective. Long before Benedict Cumberbatch donned the detective's iconic coat, Arthur Conan Doyle was living a life full of contradictions, adventures, and eccentricities that could rival any plot twist found in one of his mystery stories. From communicating with ghosts to running for Parliament, believing in fairies, starting skiing trends, and helping inspire dinosaurs in literature, Conan Doyle led an extraordinary life that rarely gets the spotlight it deserves. Let's begin with the odd fact that although he created the hyperlogical Holmes, Doyle himself was deeply invested in the supernatural. He didn't just dabble, he was a leading proponent of spiritualism, a belief system rooted in the idea that the living could communicate with the dead. He didn't treat this like a hobby. He devoted entire books, articles, and public lectures to the cause, traveling internationally to speak about spirits. He once even claimed to have communicated with historical figures like Joseph Conrad and Cecil Rhodes. It got to the point where he reportedly said he wanted to be remembered not for Sherlock Holmes, but for his contributions to communicating with the afterlife. That's right, he literally thought talking to ghosts was more important than creating the most famous detective in literature. If that doesn't surprise you, perhaps the fact that he helped popularize skiing in England will. Doyle fell in love with skiing, a sport that was still relatively unknown in Britain at the time, while he was living in Switzerland in the 1890s. After mastering the slopes in the Alps, he wrote a glowing article in the Strand magazine describing the joys and mechanics of skiing. This was more than just a travel essay. His enthusiastic portrayal practically introduced the sport to a new audience and sparked interest in England, where people quickly began participating. Who would have thought the father of Sherlock Holmes was also the patron saint of British skiers? Speaking of dramatically poetic endings, Doyle's own death sounds like something out of one of his own stories. At 71, he suffered a fatal heart attack, but not before going out in a most cinematic fashion. He was standing in his garden, holding a flower in one hand, clutched his chest with the other, collapsed to the ground, and whispered to his wife, "You are wonderful." If that doesn't belong in a Victorian novel, nothing does. Even his friendships were story-worthy, especially his complicated relationship with famed magician and escape artist Harry Houdini. The two became fast friends in the early 1920s, bonding over their fame and shared interest in debunking hoaxes, or so Houdini thought. Doyle's wife claimed to be a medium, and during a séance, she supposedly contacted Houdini's deceased mother. She wrote out a 15-page letter in English, a language Houdini's Hungarian mother never spoke. Oh, and she also forgot to mention that the séance occurred on her birthday. Houdini saw it as a clear fraud. Doyle, in contrast, remained utterly convinced of the letter's authenticity. Their friendship fell apart and never recovered, proving that even rationalists and magicians can't always agree on the fine print of ghost mail. And it wasn't just Houdini that Doyle publicly clashed with. He also went head-to-head with famed playwright George Bernard Shaw over the Titanic disaster. Just weeks after the sinking, Shaw criticized the press and public reaction, accusing them of romanticizing the tragedy and ignoring serious failures like the captain's recklessness. Doyle fired back, accusing Shaw of insulting national pride and belittling the dead. It became an intellectual slapfight that played out in the newspapers, showcasing Doyle's patriotic fervor and tendency to view reality through a melodramatic, sometimes nationalistic lens. But hold on, things get weirder. The creator of the most logical character in literary history genuinely believed in fairies. When photographs of the so-called Cottingley fairies were published, showing little girls posing with what looked like real fairies, Doyle was all in. He published articles and even wrote a book, The Coming of the Fairies, wholeheartedly defending the photographs as authentic evidence. He refused to acknowledge any possibility of deception, even when the girls later admitted the fairies were just paper cutouts. It's the kind of gullibility Holmes would have sneered at, but Doyle was committed to magic, whether others believed or not. On the less magical side of his career, Doyle was also responsible, at least indirectly, for the title of The Lost World, the Jurassic Park sequel. That's because Doyle himself had written a novel called The Lost World in 1912, about an expedition to a plateau in the Amazon basin where dinosaurs still roamed. The book helped kickstart the dinosaurs survive in secret genre, and even inspired Michael Crichton when naming his own sequel. So if you're a fan of raptors and T-Rexes on screen, you partly have Conan Doyle to thank. And before he became a full-time writer, Doyle studied medicine at the University of Edinburgh. He worked as a ship surgeon on a whaling boat during his studies, which gave him first-hand experience of adventure, hardship, and horror. Exactly the kind of real-life exposure that helped fuel his storytelling chops. But after opening his own practice, business was slow. In fact, he once noted that he could sit in his office from 10 a.m. to 4 p.m. without seeing a single patient. Luckily for us, this boredom pushed him into fiction. He'd write stories between patients, which is how Sherlock Holmes was born. Oh, and did you know Doyle also tried his hand at politics? Twice, actually. He ran for Parliament as a Unionist but lost both times. He didn't lose by much. One election was decided by fewer than 600 votes. If he had won, we might have gotten fewer stories about Holmes and more about tax policy. Still, his ambition didn't end there. One of the most remarkable things about him was that he didn't just write mysteries. He solved them. In 1906, he became involved in the real-life case of George Adalji, a half-Indian solicitor wrongfully accused of mutilating animals. Doyle used Holmes-like reasoning to prove the case was based on shoddy evidence and racial prejudice. His efforts helped clear Adalji's name and sparked reforms in Britain's criminal justice system, including the establishment of the Court of Appeals. It's one of the few times fiction directly influenced the law. Despite all this, Doyle was knighted not for his literary genius, but for war propaganda. During the Boer War, he wrote a pamphlet defending British actions, which the government loved. His writing helped sway public opinion and justify the conflict, and for that he was awarded knighthood by King Edward VII. Let that sink in. Creating Sherlock Holmes didn't get him knighted. Writing about war did. But if you're looking for the root of all this brilliance, look no further than his mother, Mary Doyle. She was a great storyteller and often spun tales of heroism and bravery to distract her children from their father's alcoholism and mental illness. Doyle credited her with inspiring his love of storytelling, and even said her tales gave him the foundation for creating Holmes and his other characters. In a way, Mary Doyle is the unsung co-creator of the detective who would go on to shape crime fiction for generations. Another bizarre yet charming tale involves what might be the world's most observant cab driver. When Doyle arrived in Boston for a lecture, a cab driver called him by name without being introduced. Doyle was amazed and asked how the man knew who he was. The cabbie launched into a string of Sherlock Holmes-worthy observations, Doyle's coat had been rumpled by reporters in New York. His shoes had buffalo mud. His hair was cut in Philadelphia, and then finished with a laugh. Also, your name's written on your luggage. Cliché driver. But perhaps the weirdest, most ironic twist in all of this. Doyle came to loathe Sherlock Holmes. He saw the character as a distraction from more serious work, particularly his writings on history and spiritualism. In a fit of frustration, he killed Holmes off in The Final Problem, sending him plummeting over the Reichenbach Falls in a struggle with Professor Moriarty. The backlash was immediate and intense. Over 20,000 people cancelled their subscriptions to the Strand magazine. Readers wore black armbands in mourning. One angry woman reportedly struck Doyle with her umbrella in protest. In the end, Doyle had to bring Holmes back, so in The Empty House, he invented a miraculous way for Holmes to survive. His fans got their way, and Doyle was stuck with a character he resented. Still, it's a testament to how deeply readers connected with Holmes, possibly the first instance of fan-driven resurrection in literary history. So there you have it. 14 weird facts about Sir Arthur Conan Doyle that paint a portrait far more colorful, strange, and intense than most people realize. He was a doctor, war propagandist, dinosaur enthusiast, spiritualist, political hopeful, real-life sleuth, and reluctant literary superstar. He believed in fairies, loved skiing, tangled with magicians, defended the honor of a sinking ship's captain, and tried desperately to escape the shadow of a character he couldn't shake. In short, Arthur Conan Doyle lived a life that wasn't just about writing fiction. It was a life that was fiction, filled with plot twists, irony, magic, and mystery. And perhaps that's why Sherlock Holmes endures, because the man who created him was every bit as fascinating as the detective he brought to life. The game may be afoot, but the story of Doyle is already a case well worth solving.